And I'd like to welcome you, and I'm actually going to say a word about the foundation that is sponsoring tonight's talk. Tonight's talk is our annual Norbert and Charlotte Rieger Scholar in Residence. We've been having these Scholar in Residences every year for over 30 years. Dr. Norbert Rieger, was a brilliant, visionary, and extraordinarily compassionate child psychiatrist. He was a member of our community, a member of our congregation, and well respected, all over, and worked particularly with the most severely disabled children. And he was a beloved person in the mental health world and in our community. And before he died, he and his wife set up a foundation that has provided an extraordinary amount of funding for institutions in Israel, for graduate education in Israel, and also for our community, for our preschool, and also for this lecture series. So I want to really take this moment to remember Dr. Rieger, and also and Charlotte, and also to thank the members of the Rieger Foundation, of whom tonight one is here. Lynn Glassman has been. Has it been ever since the founding of the foundation that Lynn and her husband Tuli have been sitting on that board? Many of the members of that board have passed away, and so Lynn is really the ferocious advocate for the Riegers and for the Rieger Foundation, and I really want to pay tribute to Lynn. So with that, to introduce our speaker tonight, somebody who's known to, I think, almost all of us, Steve Zipperstein, who is really our local expert in the Middle East. And so I thought, because he knows our guest speaker, I thought it'd be great to have Steve introduce him. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Cohen. The junior varsity is about to introduce the varsity captain. Thrilled and honored to be able to introduce David Makovsky this evening. David needs no introduction in our community. He's been here many times at UCSB. You have a huge and loyal fan base here in Santa Barbara. So just very quickly to go over some of the highlights of David's distinguished career. David currently is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's the director of the Koret Project on Arab-Israel relations. He's an adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University at the School of Advanced International Studies. He's president of the board for the National Library of Israel's United States affiliate, and in 2013 and 2014, he worked in the office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian Negotiations. David is a prolific author, a prolific writer, both in his prior career as a journalist, where he's written for, of course, the top newspapers around the world. David has also co-authored a book with the co-captain of the varsity team, his co-captain Dennis Ross, a book called Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. David has testified before the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, and various subcommittees many times. But one thing I really want to bring to your attention, which is just so incredible, is that David has visited in the last few years more than 120 university campuses in the United States. That's really remarkable. It's a testament to his commitment and his dedication to educating our young people about the conflict. And tomorrow, David, thank you. Not yet, not yet. You're not introduced. And tomorrow, David and his partner, Ray Thalamari, will be at UCSB again. Now, David, it's your turn. Welcome, David.
Actually, since the bio, I haven't updated in a while, at 186 campuses. So it's a lot of visits, but it's always, UCSB has always welcomed us, and I think 7 times. We did this reverse negotiations that Rafe and I do together, and we really, UCSB gave us our start. And I think Rafe and I have done about 70 or 80 together, but I believe here in Brown and the Schaefer family were very key, and I know they're members of your synagogue too. So it's great to be, I feel like a home here, and I really want to thank so many. I want to thank the Rieger Foundation, Lynn, and everyone for hosting us. I want to thank the rabbi who I met recently. I'm told I'm allowed to say it was at a Middle East conference in Europe, which is like an oasis in the middle of a war zone of bringing Arabs, Israelis, Americans, and all types of people from across the Middle East together. And I've gotten to know Steve through that, and he's had a real leadership role, and I think you should be very proud of Steve Zipperstein, because he really plays a key role. So thank you, and I also want to thank Marcy and John Wimbish. Marcy and my wife Varda, who's actually here. She doesn't come to too many of my speeches, but she's here tonight, and they are college friends, and I got to know Marcy, and then I got to know John, and it's been really, it's really been a delight. So I want to thank you guys too for having us. Thank you very much. So where are we? Look, I know we can't compete with the Oscars that are going on tonight. So those of you who came, I know you really care because you chose this over at least the end of the Oscars. But I think the drama of the Middle East could outpace as anything that we could imagine at the Oscars because, and I'm not saying this like, oh, you must say this at every speech. No, no, no. I really believe these next 72 hours are going to be really crucial, and I don't think people fully understand why they're so crucial. And it's, you know, when Marcy and I talked about it, I knew Ramadan was beginning tonight, and I thought, oh wow, these negotiations work? I might be in Santa Barbara when this is all coming down. So they're crucial because, you know, my day job at the Washington Institute is we're in touch with the administration, whoever the administration is, Democrats, Republicans, doesn't matter. Our job is to make sure that we bring whatever resources and knowledge to bear to help the United States. That's our country, and how navigate future steps. So, you know, it's clear that talking to the White House, talking to the State Department at a high level at each time, and you know, that all the eggs of the United States are basically on these talks. I mean, I hope I don't sound overly dramatic, but I think the U.S. approach was get a deal and use this as like an off-ramp for a 6-week pause to, first of all, you can get 40 hostages out, and, you know, sadly, not many of them are alive. I mean, you know, I think it's, you know, 134, I think is the official number, but I think 33, IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, has said that they think are not alive, but we think the number is actually much greater, you know, and maybe only about half are alive. And so if you can get 40 of those half out, you've come a distance. You want to get everybody out, of course, every single person. But the idea of that in 6 weeks, you could kind of cool things down in the Middle East, you know, so you get the hostages out and you don't let Hamas use Ramadan, the holy month, as a trigger, you know, to ignite the region. And it's a good, and hopefully you pivot, I'm going to talk about this a little later on, is you pivot to a regional agenda with Saudi Arabia, which I'm going to get to. But that's all premised on a deal. And the problem in the Middle East is there's often brinkmanship. And in brinkmanship, in the Middle East, they don't always know where the brink is. And so the chances of miscalculation are high. So you don't know for sure. But if they want a deal, they always stake out maximalist positions. They leak things that this guy's being unreasonable. No, that one's being unreasonable. But then if they want the deal, you know, what is the ratio of prisoners of Israel, of Hamas released to hostages? So, I mean, if they want the deal, they know how to do that. But my fear, and I said this to a very senior guy at the White House over breakfast, he and I had alone last week, I said, the problem is it's all predicated on a sociopath named Yahya Sinwar. And he wanted to light up the Middle East on October 7th. And that same kind of calculus could say, Ramadan is my second chance. You know, I failed on October 7th. I was hoping to get what he calls the axis of resistance. That is Hezbollah. That is, there's another different Hezbollah type in Iraq. There's Iranian proxies in Syria. There's the Houthis that now become famous, in Yemen. And there's a bunch of them. And, to ignite almost like a regional war. And he thought they would come, and he was disappointed. As a matter of fact, we have someone at the Washington Institute in my think tank who monitors social media in Lebanon, and she was telling me on October 7th, they all thought that they were going to join in on social media. The Shia, the Hezbollah people thought they were going to join, and as soon as Joe Biden came to the Middle East and said, I'm sending an aircraft carrier, going to be in the Eastern Mediterranean, basically off the coast of Lebanon, she said, David, you should have seen social media just totally shut down. It was like, this is not our war. And Nasrallah of Hezbollah has given like 6 speeches. I wouldn't have predicted this. 6 speeches why he's not joining. Why is he not joining? Well, partly is the supreme leader, the head of Iran. They're an Iranian proxy. They view, the Hezbollah perched on Israel's northern border with Lebanon as an insurance policy. Israel hits the nuclear program of Iran, they hit Israel. So for them, it's like a little bit, I can't resist sports analogies. I don't know if it's a precise analogy, but it's like pulling your goalie. If you're gonna get your insurance policy out, because that insurance policy might get chewed up in a war with Israel, then you don't want to do it. So there's a lot of border skirmishes, and 80,000 people are out of their homes in northern Israel. It's not a joke, it's a huge deal. But so far, it's within bounds. Everything is within a zone, and there's no grand war. So the U.S. The theory of the case, so to speak, was we got to work towards March 10th, and today's March 10th. So this is a very dramatic day, and look, because of the brinkmanship, I don't say never, because I think in the Middle East, if there's a deal that's supposed to be at midnight, it could go on till 12:30. It doesn't do it on the. But all the signs are negative. They're all bad right now. And what we don't know is if we're at this fork in the road, where what we've seen until now is child's play, and things could get much worse. And that's why this is a key week, a key 72 hours. I mean, again, maybe by putting the word 72 hours as I'm being a little too finite. A key few days, okay? A key few days, because if Sinwar is the way we think, his view is I get the second shot at October 7th. In other words, maybe there will be such a blow up at the Temple Mount, what Muslims call the Haram al-Sharif or the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that will be the trigger to something wider. And so that's why all eyes are right now on the Temple Mount, and the social media is going crazy. And those of you who follow it, you know this. I mean, they're telling people, barricade yourself in Al-Aqsa, in the mosque, and then force a confrontation with Israel. So the whole concept of the United States was get a hostage deal by March 10th, by the start of Ramadan, and then give it a shot at least for a quieter Ramadan. But that requires 2 to tango, right? I mean, Sinwar, the leader, has got to do that. But if he feels that he is a historic, Muslim in the great, pantheon with Salah ad-Din and this, from the Middle Ages, and I don't know if I'm going to prevail, but I'm sure going to go down in a blaze of glory, then his calculations are not the same as the United States, Israel, Egypt, Qatar, that have invested a huge amount of effort in these talks. The head of the CIA is a busy guy. Bill Burns, anyone I've had the privilege of know him a little bit, not through the CIA, but when he was at the State Department, he's really one of America's greatest of this generation diplomats. And the United States is basically, he's shuttling to Paris, to Doha in Qatar, to Cairo. He's come to Israel a bunch of times the last couple months, you know. I mean, so the U.S. has put enormous amount of prestige and effort in trying to get this deal done by tonight. And so far, no deal. So these are really dramatic times. And I just pray, I don't know, we're, you know, both in a synagogue and at a church, so I feel like I'm diversified, you know, in terms of prayer, that I pray that there's a deal, that there's a way to just cool off for a month, because this would allow for a surge in humanitarian aid, because of all we know people are suffering, and it would be a chance for the U.S. to try to pivot, and I'll talk about the Saudis in a little bit. Let me just tell you what I wanted to do. So I wanted to set the scene. We're in a very dramatic week, okay? I made that point. I want to give a sense of the history. How did we get to this point? A little bit behind the scenes, to the extent I can help on that, about the back and forth between Washington and Jerusalem and other capitals, and where does it go? And then hopefully don't talk too long and have time for questions. And I look forward to that discussion. Okay, thank you, Rabbi. So, look, I would say, how do we get to this point? And I was invited to one of the campuses that I've spoken to. I was invited to the Harvard Business School, and we had 800 students the week of Thanksgiving. I thought no one's going to show up. They're going to want to go home early or something. And it was filled to the rafters at the Klarman Hall, and it was like an opera hall. There was like balconies on balconies. And I said, like, people don't know history. Like, they don't know basics. Like, you know, I wrote a book on the Oslo talks and Israel's decision-making in '93. I was at the White House lawn. It was a great thrill for me. I got to travel around the world with Yitzhak Rabin, who was prime minister. And you really felt when you traveled with Rabin, you were in the presence of greatness. It'll always be a highlight of my life. And to travel with him, he's like Israel's de Gaulle. He really had a sense of what was the big picture and what needed to be done. Sadly, tragically, he paid for it with his life, and we'll never forget that. Anyway, but I would say in Oslo, the talks, the thing they agreed on first was Gaza, and that was like, okay, we gotta walk before we can run. We maybe have to crawl before we can walk. But what we have to do is, we can't solve all the problems at once. Let's solve what we can. Let's defer what is too hard. But the first thing they thought they could solve was Gaza. And I was there in Cairo on May 4th, was it, 1994, when they had the ceremony about Gaza and Jericho. There was there's a lot of drama around it because Yasser Arafat wouldn't sign the maps right away, and Rabin says, if he doesn't sign, I didn't sign, and this was being seen around the world, and the ceremony came to a halt until they fixed it. But anyway, Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, that means that's the Palestinian government that would be based in Ramallah in the West Bank. They started out in Gaza, and Arafat started in Gaza. And it was very hard for Israel to do a deal with Arafat because they saw him as an arch terrorist. But he said, okay, I'm willing to sign, to be for coexistence. Now, did he mean it? I think is a real question. People say you only make peace with your enemies, but you make peace with an enemy who, at least in principle, is willing to be your friend. You can't make peace with an enemy who's determined to remain an enemy. That's impossible. So that's a big difference. It's an important distinction. So in '94, Israel turned over Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. And then the next key moment is 2005, where no less than Ariel Sharon, who was the architect of the settler movement, said, you know what, I built these settlements in 1971 when I was the head of the Southern Command because I was worried that the Egyptian tanks, like they came in '67, would sweep up the coast, so I'll put settlements there. Because he wasn't a believer on the religious ideology. And he also knew that Gaza was not historically part of Eretz Israel, But then he realized, hey, in 1971, I didn't know about 1977. 1977, Anwar Sadat, right, makes his electrifying trip, one of the greatest moments of the 20th century, I think worldwide, where he just says, I'm the biggest Arab state, I'm going to the Knesset. I'm going to speak to them in the Israeli parliament. And that leads to the peace treaty of 1979. I'm not trying to overwhelm you with dates. I'm just trying to think that Sharon pulls back and says, you know what, we don't need the settlements. If the Palestinian Authority is running things from 1994, let's take out the 8,500 settlers in Gaza. And so Sharon, and he was called a traitor, he was called all sorts of names on the right, but he thought this was the right thing. It has no strategic value. I only did this for the strategic value, not for the religious value. And if we have peace with Egypt, we don't need it. And he said, I want to get out of their way. I don't want an excuse of saying Israel's occupying or something like that. And so in 2005, the settlers were pulled out. And it was a traumatic moment for Israel. If you talk to Bezalel Smotrich, the current finance minister on the hard right of Israel, for him, it was the formative experience of his life. He can't get over it. How could they do such a thing by removing the settlers in Gaza? But Israel did it. Now, its hope was, okay, we're not going to get flowers from the Palestinian Authority, but if they, we're not on the ground there, we're not settling the area, give it to them. Like, let them have a better life and let them have some hope. But then 2007 would change that trajectory forever. And I keep saying, I said that at Harvard Business School when I was on with the dean of Princeton, a woman, Mani Jamal, a religious Palestinian woman who covers her hair. I said, that was a moment we've never recovered really from 2007. We live in the shadow of 2007 because and I said this on the PBS NewsHour, which is kind of my media home away from home, and I said, look, you had a few armed militants of Hamas, terrorists, and they outmuscled, they outmaneuvered the PA, and they literally threw them off rooftops. They didn't throw Jews off, they threw Palestinians off rooftops, and they kicked them out. And that was it. That changed the trajectory. Then they still fired on Israel. And Israel says, wait a second, if we left and they're still firing, we don't owe them to be able to import rockets to fire on us. And that's where Israel put on its blockade to say, we don't want you firing at us, especially since we left the territory. Now, I know there'll be people that might ask me, but isn't it true, David, that Israel controlled the airspace and offshore? And I'd say yes, but if Hamas in 2007 would have built something positive, it would have put huge pressure on Israel to do more withdrawals in the West Bank. Because if you would have liked the book, you might have wanted to see the movie. But if you hated the book, you'll never want to see the movie. So it became the ultimate deterrent of what not to do. People said, what are you, crazy? Look what they just did. You got out and they still fired on you. All you wanted was a partner. You wanted someone who would say, I want to build a society alongside you. I want it to be a proud, independent Palestinian state. It won't be complete yet, of course, until we have the West Bank. But we're going to show you that we could build something positive. That would have had a huge impact. But that wasn't what Hamas wanted. Now, you could say, well, this is very Western of me to say this, but there was still hope at a certain point. And look, there were wars and campaigns, we can call them now. Compared to this, nothing's like this. But 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, there were 4 rounds with Hamas. I was in the U.S. government in 2014. We had 51 days of this. Nothing like 155 days now, but 156. But then people said, well, look, maybe we could somehow focus on the economics. Maybe we could take the edge off this a little bit by giving people skin in the game. Because if you give people some hope, which everyone wanted, maybe that would be a counterpoint to Hamas's ideology. If enough people had jobs, if they could feed their families, if they, in Israel, the salary is 9 times what it is in Gaza. So 18,500 people under this past government, not the current government, Benny Gantz, who I just got a chance to sit with for an hour when he was in Washington last week, right, an hour before he saw Kamala Harris. He was the defense minister, and the Shin Bet and Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, and a bunch of others, they said, let's go for it. Let's try. What do we lose by giving people jobs? And then they maybe could come back to the people in Gaza and say, listen, I work in Israel, and I could feed my families, and if we could take the edge off Hamas's ideology, instead of 18,500, we could have 180,500. And basically that was Israel's hope. And that was what became known as the conceptia, the concept, or the governing assumption, if you will, a hope that you could take the edge off. Sadly, that's not what Hamas wanted. And I take it even further, and I want to be careful I never want to speak in hyperbolic terms. I'm not saying the 18,500 people that had jobs in Israel were all Hamas agents, okay? But Hamas could squeeze people because they could say, hey, you're getting a job 9 times the salary of another Gazan. And why can you get that job and they can't? So we're going to have to ask you a few questions. In Kfar Aza, I want to know who lives where. Who has kids? Where do the dogs? In which room and what So this is stuff you don't get off of Google Maps or Google Earth or any of that. It's human intelligence. And so the 18,500 became an intel source for Hamas. And that's what's so tragic, because if you're an Israeli, the trauma of October 7th was so overwhelming that here were people we trusted, we invited them in our homes to work and in our fields, and now they're the ones giving the intel to Hamas. So again, I'm not accusing these 18,500. I assume they were squeezed pretty hard, but this is something Israel didn't see coming. I sat with, I'll leave it a little more vague. I sat with top people of the intelligence field in Israel, and they did say to me in the summer, we are worried that the axis of resistance is going to coalesce. Why did they say that? Well, they feared that the Arabs and the Iranians would misread divisions in Israeli society. Because if you remember, most of 2023, before October 7th, was about the judicial controversy, which was devastating. And it really ripped Israel apart in a way that I feel was horrific. But I feel it left the wrong impression. And the impression was Israel's weak. The pilots don't want to fly. They don't want to do reserve duty. Israel never had this before. Special forces don't want to go on reserve duty. Intel units didn't want to do reserve duty. So all this was open to the Arabs. And we'd see there were meetings that Iran would convene, Nasrallah would convene, and the Intel people would convene. But no one could have imagined, this was a failure of imagination, that nobody, even though people said, well, wasn't there a plan that was out there? Yes. But everything got dismissed as, oh, well, that's an exercise. Oh, they really can't open up 60 different holes in the fence. They really can't take 28 military bases that they I mean, no one could imagine this. And there was a systemic collapse on October 7th that this was just unthinkable, and that the military didn't function in the South because they couldn't imagine it. And Hamas had occupied a lot of the military bases in the South. So even though it was on the radio, let's say that the first break in the wall was 6:29 a.m. I think by 10 to 7 a.m. was on Israel radio. And there was just like Israel 60 Minutes apparently just did a story. There was a 4 a.m. consultation where people thought this might be happening, but they weren't sure, because often you have these false positives. You have conflicting data, and it's Shabbat, and it's Simchat Torah there, to mobilize the whole military around something you're not 100% sure on, you'll get a lot of the public angry at you. And so they said, well, let's see in the morning how things look, because we've had false positives before, but this wasn't a false positive. This actually happened. So did Hamas do this because they thought Israel was at its weakest? I think that's part of it. I think part of it is, and I'll talk more later about the Saudis, but I think they thought that there was about to be a breakthrough with Saudi Arabia and Israel, orchestrated by the United States, and I think they felt that is game over. That will be like the Super Bowl, the World Cup, the World Series, the Stanley Cup, all the sports finals put together. If the Israelis get a breakthrough with the strongest, most influential, wealthiest Arab country, game over for them. So maybe, and again, we can't prove this. I didn't have coffee with Sinwar, but what if we do something so barbaric, so outrageous, such an atrocity that it will force Israel's reaction, and that reaction will be so ferocious that it will be seen on every Arab satellite TV network and in every Arab home. And that will block the Saudis. Now, I know to you that sounds like a three-cushion shot, and I can't prove it. I know Biden has said this on TV. He believes it. Every person I know believes it. But, you know, the journalist in me says, okay, give me the hard evidence. I'm not sure I have it. But we all think about it. We think about it all the time. Now, so, of course, for Israel, October 7th was just, you know, the worst traumatic experience imaginable, the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. It was reminding what the whole idea of Zionism was. It used to be stateless Jews or defenseless Jews. So how could you have a state of the Jews and defenseless Jews? Like, how could you have that? It sounds like a contradiction in terms. How could there be this systemic collapse? And it reminded Israelis how fragile their life was, that you can't take things for granted. Yes, you might be the startup nation. Yes, your GDP per capita is up there with Germany, France, Japan. I mean, you're really high flying, but you can't, physical survival is a question, even if you do have maybe a deal with the Saudis. So Israel always thought of itself as a fortress, but it realized this fortress was permeable. And it always thought it had cruel enemies, but it didn't ever really think that these enemies would rape, behead, burn alive, and engage in sexual violence the way they did. And I just spoke to a woman today who was doing this for this UN report at this UN thing with Cheryl, you know, from Facebook. What's her name? Sandberg. So no one could imagine how horrific this could have been. So that was, I think, how it got to this point. And the trauma it left behind that is being so fragile. Now the question is, okay, so what's the state of play? The state of play is that Israel mobilized the reserves, 360,000 people. And look, I think that the most reserve time that the Israelis did was 1982. They had 60 days in a row. Now Israel has sent home virtually all the reserves. The war is nowhere near the level of intensity as it was. Even though you wouldn't know that by watching television, but it's much, you don't have the reserve duty there, reservists there. The goal of the reserves was to kind of go after the organizational apparatus of Hamas in the northern part of Gaza, which it did basically up until January 1st, and then focus on the south, which was always going to be harder because that's where a lot of the people are. And you know, and I want to make sure no one misunderstands me. I said it once, I'll say it a second time. There's a lot of suffering here, and there's suffering by Palestinians. Israelis, you know, have had rockets out at their cities, but if you're a Palestinian, this is a very difficult time. I just want one thing to be clear. There's a standard that Israel's being held to that other countries are not. In Mosul, in Raqqa, Fallujah, wars. I'm not even going back to Dresden or, you know, World War II. I'm talking about 4 or 5 years ago. The United States. Urban warfare is the bloodiest warfare. We have to know that. Read a guy, John Spencer, at West Point. He's on social media. I'd recommend you read him. You know, they didn't have tunnels in Fallujah, in Mosul, in Raqqa. When the U.S. was fighting ISIS, I worked in the Obama administration, and when one soldier was beheaded, I'm not saying that was the only reason, but we went 7,000 miles to go after ISIS. And we went into Fallujah, and we went into Mosul and Raqqa, and the civilian to combatant ratio, that ratio-wise, America and its Iraq partners killed many more civilians than Israel has. Now, every person is a tragedy. And I'm not saying this to justify anything. I don't want anyone to misinterpret me, okay? Every person dies as a tragedy who's a civilian. But just know, when it came to Mosul and Raqqa and these places, the world system was set up so civilians could go to Turkey, they could go to Lebanon, they could go to Jordan. Here, the world system is nobody goes anywhere because Egypt doesn't want them in. Jordan doesn't want them in. Now, you can say Israel doesn't want them in either. Fine, that's true too. But the fear that the Arabs have that Israel is dumping the Palestinian issue on their laps, they don't want. And in the case of Egypt, Sisi's whole raison d'etre is to fight the Muslim Brotherhood. And Hamas is the Gaza chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood. He doesn't want a ton of Muslim Brotherhood people in his country. So I'm not here to attack Sisi. My point is that Israel is being held to a threshold that no other country is, including our country, the United States. You know, we didn't have to deal with the tunnels. We could get civilians out of the way, and Israel can't get civilians out of the way. What we could do is, in northern Gaza, tell people, go on the Salah ad-Din road and keep going south, and there's trucks at the end of that road in Rafah. And that's all good until you get to Rafah, which is the point I'm about to get into now. So, you know, people, I speak at campuses, I get asked about, I think it's really outrageous to talk about genocide when Israel's trying to say, here's 1.1 million people, make sure they don't get hurt, let them have this road so they are in a safe space, they're out of harm's way. They'd be in a much less of a harm's way if the border was open, and they could go to Egypt and Jordan and et cetera. But they're not allowed to. But no one talks about that in the media. And that's something that people just don't make that point. So I think, look, it's a rough situation. Israel's in the south. I do think Israel could do a better job on the humanitarian thing. I think the president has been trying very hard in trying to get understandings with the prime minister on flour coming in, open up Kerem Shalom, which is for truck inspection, so you could expedite trucks. But some people in his own government have not been trying to hurt the prime minister on this one, and his finance minister Smotrich, the police minister Ben-Gvir, who are of the hard right. And that, of course, exacerbates frustration in the White House, as you can imagine. So where are we now? Where we're now is, like I said, the U.S. Now, I want to link everything back to what I started with. The U.S.'s hope was all the eggs in the hostage for pause 6-week period, and that's supposed to start tonight. And so if it doesn't work, you know, people are going to know, now what? And here the White House is very nervous that Israel is going to go into that final city. Let's say you've hit 18 out of 24 battalions. You've broken up their command and control. There's no commanders. They're not able to communicate. Although I would say, look, they're not a normal army. They're terrorists. So I mean, like, it's enough for their pockets of 3 or 4 guys to run around with AK-47s and shoot people, even though they're not part of a structure. So you've broken the back of the structure, but doesn't mean that all those places are safe. But the last remaining places are 2. One is a place called in the Nuseirat, Deir el-Balach area in the center of Gaza, which is where I think if Israel is going to fight in Ramadan, that's where it pivots to. And then now you're going to say, David, that's dangerous to make a prediction of something so soon, because either they do it or they don't do it. Or what the White House fears is they go into Rafah, and in Hebrew, Rafiach. And that's just for those who don't know the geography, that southern part of Gaza is the crossing point into Egypt. And so why is it so important? A, it's the last there's 4 battalions there. And so, you know, the prime minister says, if you don't want us to win there, you don't want us to win the war. And I understand that position. And you know, to even strengthen that view is it's like, these are where if there's tunnels from Egypt. And I mean, like, how did they get all these weapons? How did all this stuff come in? It had to come from somewhere. Now, it's true in the middle of the decade that Egypt really clamped down a lot and closed a lot of that tunnels. But we think that there were low-level bribes, that there were, like, you know, maybe the Egyptian private at a crossing point makes maybe $10 a month, and if someone says, here's $100, you know, that's a lot of money. So I'm not saying that Sisi at the top is telling people, you know, but but low-level stuff gets through. So you've got to find a way to stop that. And now, and so I would hope the U.S. would think about working with the Egyptians, having the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to see what could be done to plug any tunnels on the Egyptian side. That might impact the calculus of Israel the way it looks at Rafah. But my fear is, this is my biggest fear, really, is that my fear is the perfect storm. Is that Sinwar wants to light up Ramadan, it's clear. And they're using social media to use the Al-Aqsa. You know, they want to keep lighting a match with Israel, make Israel look like the bad person. Because once you use religious imagery, it's a different ballgame. There's Muslims in Indonesia and Malaysia and all these places. They're everywhere, over 1.2 billion people. It's a lot. And they will see that and they don't care the details. All they know is what they see on television. That's all. All they see is they see TV. They see an Israeli is fighting with a Muslim on Al-Aqsa. Must be Israel's fault. This is a signal to us, to turn up the volume. So I'm very concerned. And then if you add that perfect storm of Rafah, you say, okay, the White House asked you, prepare a plan, 1.3 million. Remember, you told those people you did the right thing. Israel, you did the right thing. You asked these people to go to the south. There's where the trucks are. That's great. But now you've kicked the can down the road. Now you're at the end of the road with the can. So what's going to be? So if you're going to go to Rafah, you need a real plan on evacuating those 1.3. And if you fight in Rafah without that plan, I mean, it's just the perfect storm, and that's what I'm fearful of. I have faith in the Israeli military, though. I truly believe they won't go in. That's my view, and here too, I'm putting myself out there, which is against 101 and punditry. Don't predict something that's going to find out it's going to happen soon. I think they wait till after Ramadan's over. That's my view, that they try to find ways to cool it off. Already you're seeing the security establishment in Israel, tell Ben Gvir, the police minister in the cabinet, and saying, like, don't put limitations on people under 50 years old who are Israeli Arabs who want to pray, because that'll boomerang on you. It'll blow up in your face. It'll be twisted around. You'll say it's a security risk, and they'll say they're against my religion. That's how they'll interpret it. Unfairly agreed. Unfair. But that's the way it'll be spun out. So the Shin Bet, the head of the Israeli Internal Security Service, the FBI of Israel, they're saying is, don't put any limits. Here, sorry about that. Don't put any limits on people who want to pray. They want to pray, we'll find other ways. We have biometrics. We have other ways of trying to get people we think are provocateurs, but don't limit people who want to pray. Now, by the way, that doesn't yet include the West Bank. We haven't even talked about the West Bank and East Jerusalemites. But this is just Israeli Arabs. But as usually happens, the security services, in my view, are moderating forces in the Israeli internal deliberations. Their view is minimize friction. Wherever you can, minimize it. Plus, the United States won't believe you. And all these Americans, they don't know, they just know what they see on television. And so, no offense to anybody, because I know this very educated group, and that's not you. I'm not talking about you, present company excluded. But it'll be twisted around. And so the Shin Bet is saying, let people in. Be more relaxed, be more open about it. So we'll see how it plays out in Rafah. But that's been a lot of the tension. The president has said it, I think in an MSNBC interview last night, Rafah is a red line. It's this fear of a perfect storm during this month. By the way, I want to add something that should be obvious to some of you, but I realize it isn't. I say it to almost every journalist I do interviews with, is that during the month of Ramadan, Arabs waged war. I mean, like the Yom Kippur War, what Jews called the Yom Kippur War of 1973, is called the Ramadan War. Now you say, wait a second, Ramadan is in March. I thought Yom Kippur is in like September, October. But that's because in the Islamic calendar, there's not what we would call in Judaism like an Adar Bet, which is a leap year corrective month to keep the lunar and the solar kind of in sync. So it's confusing for Americans who are following this. They don't know that. So sometimes Ramadan could be in the fall, but it could gradually it goes around the whole cycle. And the way Judaism, Passover is always in the spring, and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are in September, October. So, but the Ramadan War was an Egyptian war on Israel's Jewish holiest day of the year, and they fought it the whole month. And they called the war the Ramadan War. And Hamas it strikes Israelis all the time in Ramadan. They're proud of it. So, I'm not here to argue for using violence at all. I'm just saying there is somewhat of a double standard here, where you want to invoke Ramadan when it's convenient and not when it's inconvenient. And my hope is just to cool it off, because I don't care who's right in this case. I just worry about the results, and I worry the results are very unpredictable for the next month. And that's my concern. One word, let me just say beyond, I know I probably talked too long. Let me just say a couple last words about where does this all go. All right, let's assume that I'm right and that there is no Rafah attack during Ramadan. And the army will do what it can to cool down Al-Aqsa, which is that's the flashpoint for you guys to look at. Jerusalem, it goes from Gaza to Jerusalem now. To see if, if the people want to light it up, this is where they're going to want to light it up. So if they get through this month, then I think the goal, the U.S., the plan, like I said, putting the eggs in the pause basket of 6 weeks was to try to pivot to Saudi Arabia and to say, Saudi, and this is to you, and I know this will also sound a little bit like a three-cushion shot also, but you need to understand this because if you don't get it, you don't see the whole picture. Saudi Arabia, and I'm zooming out for a second, but I want you to see how it connects, okay? I'm not trying to take you off on a tangent, but it's important for you to understand this piece of the puzzle because it's a key piece. The Saudis, are not part of NATO. Like if Putin hits Germany, the U.S. goes to war for Germany against Putin. Saudis don't have that. And they see their biggest enemy not as Israel, but as Iran. And they have to make their deals with Iran. They don't want things to just blow up. They want to find if they could find certain arrangements with Iran. But they are like sworn enemies with the Iranians. And their view was that the Aramco oil fields were hit in 2019 under the previous administration, didn't respond to that. And their view is if the United States is not going to respond to attack on the second biggest Saudi oil field, they're not going to come to our aid. The Americans have got other things that they're working on. They're pivoting to Asia. They don't care about the Middle East. Every day there's another U.S. member of Congress that gets up and says, we're energy independent. We don't need the Middle East anymore. They hear that in the Middle East. The day they say it, they hear it. Okay, one guy sneezes, the other one catches a cold, And so their view is, we don't believe any of these American presidents because they come in every 4 years. Sometimes they're for sanctions on Iran, sometimes they're against sanctions on Iran. It's easy to say, well, when you're a kingdom, you think you're a king for 50 years. So you have a different kind of time perspective. Their view is the only thing that will make a difference is a defense treaty with the United States. If it's American law will have to kick in if our existence is really being attacked. And so we want a defense treaty with America. Now, America's not had a treaty, I don't think, since Japan in 1960. It was a different America. It was in the shadow of World War II. There was one with Korea in the mid-50s, South Korea. So to get a treaty, you need 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. 2/3 of the U.S. Senate can't agree is it dark or light outside. That's how polarized America is today. And I want you to see how this all connects. So basically, you've got a new generation there. And I'm not here to excuse anything. There was a horrific incident of the Crown Prince dealing with a certain journalist. MBS, we call him Mr. Bonesaw. I mean, it was a horrible story. But basically, this is a new generation that doesn't have the hang-ups about Israel that the parents' generation had. So their view is, wait a second, Israel, they're against the Iranians. Their GDP is phenomenal. They've really got their act together. We've got to think post-oil. How do we digitize? How do we diversify our economy? And Israel, they're part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. So when the U.S. comes to us and say, hey, you want 67 fingers in the U.S. Senate to get a defense treaty, the U.S. says, make it a package deal. Sweeten the pot, as a lot of the people work in the financial world, sweeten it. Find a way that it makes sense. So what about a peace with Saudi and Israel? Okay, why not? They're good. They're part of the solution. They're not part of the problem. We've had kind of certain intel links over the years. That's a good thing. So their peace with Israel is instrumentalist. In other words, it's not that they woke up one day and said, peace with Israel above everything. No, it's like it's a byproduct. It's a way to get to what we really want, which is a defense treaty with the United States. So it's in that context that a lot has been going on behind the scenes. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor of the President, Brett McGurk, Middle East Coordinator, Bill Burns, the CIA Director, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, going to Saudi, going in and out to see can we do the grand, what I call the mega deal, or the grand bargain. And the Saudis were into it. And now the question was, could you get the deal done? So this was all over the Arab world. This is why I think Hamas, and the president certainly thinks that, he says it, why they did this, because like, game over. I mean, if the Israelis have peace with the Saudis, what's left? Algeria, a few other little countries, and the Saudis might be able to bring along Muslim countries too, like Indonesia and some others, the biggest Muslim country in the world. So I think that if you say, what's the American big picture? The American big picture was to pivot off this war and get back to the main event. They see this as a sideshow, so to speak, to get this. Now, I'm worrying the numbers don't fully, there's no time left because we're in an election year. And you can say for the United States, why do we want a defense treaty? What's in our interest? Well, we want to somewhat marginalize China's role in the Middle East. And part of the negotiation with Saudi is a very detailed negotiations on what sort of infrastructure they could buy, what sort of microchips they could buy, semiconductors. It's very, in terms of Huawei, a lot of the Chinese infrastructure, it's very detailed. So I think it's a strategic win for the U.S. For this president, who considers himself a lifelong Zionist, if I pull this off, this is, you heard of the Abraham Accords? This is the super duper Abraham Accords. This is the Joseph Accords, like Joseph Biden. This is bigger than anyone's done. And you say it's an election year. Now, some of you will say, no one votes on foreign policy in an election year. They vote on economics, meat and potatoes. True. But every president wants the resume, the checklist. I did this, I did this, I did this. So pulling this off would have been really great for him. The question is there enough time? And I don't know if there is. There's something called the Lindsey Graham thesis, and it's totally counterintuitive. Lindsey Graham is a staunch Republican, but Lindsey Graham has come around to the view, he's been shuttling also in these negotiations, he's come around to the view that says only Biden can pull this off. Again, whether you like Biden, you don't like Biden, I'm not here to weigh in on that. I have it easy. I just deal with Israelis and Palestinians. I leave Biden, Trump to somebody else. But, I say, he said, look, to get 67 in the Senate is not easy. And a lot of Democrats traditionally don't like the Saudis because of their association with big oil, of course, the Khashoggi story and other reasons. So Graham said, if I was you, and he said this publicly, if I were you, Crown Prince, cut a deal with Biden. I'm saying this as a Republican. Only Biden can get you 67. If the next administration comes in, we'll get 51. We'll be lucky to get 51 because we won't have the Democrats probably. Now, that might not be true. Lindsey Graham might be wrong. And maybe this thing, you could say if it's the right deal, it'll be the right deal in 2025 too. But it's certainly easier in 2024. That's what I think the president wanted. Now, if you had wrapping a frame where the Saudis were now part of a new regional strategy, the question would be what could happen on the Palestinians? And here, I think you get some real tough questions that are very fair to put. Israel's, because of Hamas, Israel doesn't want Hamas back. Like I said, the Palestinian Authority has, not exactly shown a great grip in the West Bank. And again, if you didn't like the book, we like the movie, you're gonna, but I don't know what the alternative, I don't think there's a third way out of this. I think you're gonna have, the Palestinian Authority at least you can work with on basics. Now, does that mean it's a pathway to a Palestinian state? I think it's a start. I think there's some other things maybe in the Q&A I can get into it because it's a little more detailed. But I do think that there's some things that can be done. I don't know if this government could do it, to be blunt. I think there's going to have to be an election in Israel. You look at the polls in Israel, sitting with Benny Gantz, I see the country wants unity. They don't want polarization. They want someone who brings them together. Is he Yitzhak Rabin? Very few people are Yitzhak Rabin because he won the 1967 war and he had a very strong analytical bent. But Gantz tries to have this image of, I'm the father of the country kind of thing. I want to be a unifier. I don't want to be a divider. So I think in theory, and he said this publicly, I'm not divulging any secrets. He said, with all my baggage with Netanyahu that there was supposed to be rotation and he rescinded and all that, I can work with him as long as we don't have really ultra-right people in the government. But, I come back to sports. You can't always get the people from the end zones, but maybe from the 30-yard line to the 30-yard line, people can work together. I think October 7th should teach us that unity is so important, that if you don't bring people together, you're just going to have constant strife it's, obvious. But Israel doesn't have the luxury for these kinds of divisions. What made Israel great was its cohesiveness, that despite all its enemies, it was united internally behind a central premise that after 1900 years of Jewish statelessness, the Jews deserve a state, and they don't have the luxury to be, sniping at each other in a way that would undermine that Zionist enterprise. So I do hope that October 7th allows people to zoom out a little bit and remind them of what's truly important. And that is, there has to be this sense of cohesiveness. And people ask me this all the time, David, are you optimistic, pessimistic? And I think, I truly believe this deeply, that ultimately I think that as difficult as this situation is, I'm not underestimating it and how the trauma that Israel's facing. I really think that ultimately Israel's willingness to live is greater than its enemies' willingness to die. And so in the most literal sense possible, Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you all very, very much. I'll open it up. Come on, people.
Thank you, David.
Delighted.
Incredible. And thank you so much. So we have time for some questions. And I'm going to do my best to kind of, move around the room. And so I'm going to start with one of our presidents, our other co-president, Nancy Sheldon.
I have about 50 questions, but I'll limit it to one, and then I'll ask you on the side to get the answers to the others. You just said that Gantz can work with Netanyahu, but he won't work with the right. But Netanyahu is not willing to give up the right. So can you explain that to me?
Right, good. I'm glad you asked that. Okay. So look, right now, there's no doubt that Netanyahu's, and by the way, if we don't get to everyone's question, I'll stick around till afterwards. When I go to the campuses, I stay to the very last question. I don't know if I should say that here, but I'll because I also have hosts. So, but I want to really get to everybody if I can. Look, right now, if you look at the numbers, Gantz he's polling at about 37 seats. The Knesset is 120. You need 61 to govern. And right now, before Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot joined, they were 64. That was the Bibi kind of Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, ultra-Orthodox coalition. So now with those guys, I think you've gone from 64 to 76. Bibi's convinced that Gantz and Eisenkot, two former chiefs of staff, in the centrist party called HaMachaneh Mamlachti, there's no real good translation of the word Mamlachti. Machaneh is camp, right? Mamlachti is country first, I think is the closest. So, and by the way, if you look at the breakdown of Gantz's voters, I showed this to someone in the White House last week, 59 to 33, the Gantz voters want to stay in the government because they feel a sense of country first. They feel that Sinwar is not, they haven't gotten Sinwar or any of the 6 leaders of Hamas, and the hostages are still there. The war's still going on. So it's like we don't have that luxury to leave in the middle of the war. But Bibi's convinced because the polling data is so favorable to Gantz. And by the way, with the non-Bibi forces, let's say there's 71, and Bibi's at like 47, 48. That's if you add the ultra-Orthodox. He's at 16, 18 as a party, but you can't just look at the parties. You have to look at the cluster of parties that would make the coalition and the opposition. So he says, I think he's also mirror imaging a little bit, wow, if I had these numbers, I would leave too. So I think in a certain way, he's looking beyond them. He's seeing these guys are halfway out the door, even though they say they're not, and I'm going to be stuck with the dance with the hard right people who brought me. So he doesn't want to alienate them because he sees them once again as holding the balance of power, even though technically today they don't, because Gantz is part of the coalition. So even, let's say there's 76, But he says, yeah, and so even if those guys left, they're 14. 76 minus 14 is 62. You need 61. So in theory, he doesn't need those guys. But in the real world of politics, his view is, yeah, I don't need them, but I think Benny's out the door. As soon as the war stops, he's gone, and then I'm back to these guys again. So he becomes very solicitous of these guys because he thinks ultimately he will need them. So the question is a very fair question, and I got asked this by several senior people in the administration. David, like link the dots here, how does this work? Let's say some people think, well, as soon as the war is over, there'll be hundreds of thousands of people to the streets, angry at October 7th. It's all been swept under the rug because no one wants to protest during a war. I mean, there are some scattered protests, but not at the force that you saw with the judicial protest this past year. So some people think that's going to do it. It'll be like what we call the Agranat Commission of 1974, where after the 73 war, they had a commission of inquiry. Golda Meir was not mentioned. And if those of you who've seen the movie, you know that she kept talking about this commission. And the commission said, we're only looking at the military people. We're not going to pass judgment on the political people. And because Israel lost 2,600 kids in the 73 war, the fact that Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan were seen as above it all and exempt from scrutiny led to mass protests, and it was the protest that brought them down, I think, after 10 days. So does history repeat itself? We don't know. Does history lead to, it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, where you could find 4 backbenchers and the Likud who would break ranks, so 64 becomes 60, and then 60 triggers an election. I'm convinced that Gantz's strategy now, I can say this with authority, but I'm not saying it's a high probability one. It's going to sound to you a little esoteric, so just bear with me for a second. There's something called the draft law. The draft law is about the ultra-Orthodox, and now what's happened is with all these, with wars, there's now people said, well, we used to say you got out of reserve duty at the age of 40. By the way, it used to be 54. We're going to jack it up to 46. And number of maximum reservist days, we're going to jack that up too. So now suddenly the public is more and more, don't have enough soldiers. That wasn't a problem. We didn't have those problems. But October 7th has created this whole thing that you got to be more labor intensive. You have to have more people on the borders. It's everything. So the fact that the ultra-Orthodox are not serving is more glaring. And the polling data, and again, I watch Israeli TV in Hebrew every single day, and you see the numbers are through the roof. 75 to 25 say it's I think it is, it's this is unacceptable. But for the ultra-Orthodox, they're staying in the government because in their view, this is what Bibi promised them. They want a permanent exemption. And so that was a very, very hard lift a year ago. It's impossible today, given the war. And I think what Gantz would like to do is to say, listen, the public hates you guys, you and the ultra-Orthodox, but if you agree to elections in September, I'll try to kick the can for another year on this whole issue. We'll just defer it. We'll just kick the can. Now, I just think that sounds nice, and the ultra-Orthodox leaders like Gantz personally, because he's a decent person and he cares about the country, but he's always been also for saying, why can't you do little things? Why can't you say, okay, you don't want to serve in the army, fine. But what about what they call Magen David Adom, like Israel's Red Cross, or Hatzalah? Hatzalah is the ultra-Orthodox version of Magen David Adom, the Red Cross of Israel. Why can't you do that? Why can't you, fold bandages or just do something on national service that would show the public we're in this same boat together? And if you can't do that, I'm sorry, you're going to lose people. The chief rabbi, the Sephardic chief rabbi last night said it's, if we're not exempt, we'll go to another country. Find me another country that's willing to put tens of thousands, right? Exactly. Someone said, let them find another country, make my day, find me another country that's going to subsidize tens of thousands of Kollel students. It's not going to happen. And so, I saw Yediot this morning has a headline across the top saying an outrageous comment by the chief rabbi. So anyway, will all this dynamic lead to a deal with Gantz? I think among the leaders, they're more horse traders. The problem is the base of the ultra-Orthodox. They used to be, a couple generations ago, rather, I'm sorry to use the word in a religious place, but agnostic, if you could say that, about who left of center, right of center. Today, they're much more right-wing, religiously, politically. And they don't have the room to maneuver. Shas, the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox, they actually have Bibi's picture on their campaign poster, which I've never seen in any country, that they have a photo of a different party on their party placards. So all this, I'm sorry to get in all this detail, but my point is that I wanted to answer your question thoroughly, is that I don't know if Gantz's strategy is going to work. Even though the leaders might like it, I don't know if their base follows Bibi pretty blindly, and he's going to want to try to hold out. He believes he has these other guys, and I think he thinks the further he is away from October 7th, that the public anger will somewhat be diluted, dissipated in a year from now. When I ask the Prime Minister's office, when is the next election? They go, sometime in 2025, after the commission report comes out. But they basically, you'll never survive a commission. Yeah, we won't, but we got more time. So it's a very good question. I wish the answer was as good as the question, but I wanted to go through the permutations. And that Gantz is willing to stay in the government. His people want him to stay in the government, but he wants some sense of an election that is fairly soon. And he feels that, by the way, we see the numbers, something like 63% of the Israeli public believes there should be an election because there needs to be a new mandate, that October 7th was such an earthquake for the state of Israel.
Lynn,
I'll try to be briefer in my other responses.
As our member of the Rieger Foundation, go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you for all this wonderful information. I don't know if it's so wonderful. I know Israelis are out buying guns now because they don't have faith in their army the way they used to. It's a very sad situation
Terrible.
there for the population and for the people that don't have homes in the north because
Terrible.
they're waiting for the other shoe to drop.
That's right.
But I'm wondering, whatever happened to the trial of Bibi?
Right.
Is there any chance that he would go to jail
Right,
before all this?
right. No, it's a great question about the trial. Look, the trial is going on. I have a neighbor in the Maryland suburbs, of the D.C. suburbs, who works in the Department of Justice in the U.S. and says, we have complicated trials too, but the trials are like 3 weeks. They have over 300 witnesses that they have. It's a lot of witnesses. And the Israeli system is much more slow-moving. So the trial is ongoing. The judges have been more understanding about delays during the war, when the Prime Minister said, well, I could either be with you or I could be in the war cabinet. So that has enabled them more delays. I mean, look, Israel has had a tradition of, the president of Israel went to jail, Katsav, over an issue of sexual violence. Olmert went to jail over a corruption issue. Israel could be very proud of its judiciary being so independent. And by the way, I think part of the debate last year was about that independence, but it survived that. And so I think that it's going on. I can't predict the outcome. There was one point where I think Bibi did want a plea bargain, which happened right when the Bennett government passed the budget in November of 22. And then usually when you pass a budget, you kind of got peace for like a year, because the budget is often the trigger point to bring down the government. Once he passed the budget, he thought Bennett was going to be around for another year, maybe 2 years. And he passed a request to Aaron Barak, not to be confused with Ehud Barak, but Aaron Barak, kind of Israel's premier all-star jurist, that maybe he would do a plea bargain. And my understanding is it went to Avichai Mandelblit, who is the Attorney General, and he was willing to cut a deal that Netanyahu would be out of public life. And yet the 6 division heads in the Justice Ministry who work for Mandelblit said, we worked for years and years, getting over 300 witnesses. This case is so rock solid. You're going to let this guy walk by cutting a deal, we resign en masse. And Mandelblit was in the last 6 weeks of his tenure. And when all his senior employees staged like an intifada, a revolt against him, he backed off and the plea bargain went away. Some people believe it's going to come back and that they'll go to Bougie Herzog, and I think Israel's blessed to have a great president, and I've had many meetings with him, and I can tell you when you WhatsApp the president, he gets back to you immediately. But some people think his father pardoned certain people in the Shin Bet in 1984, and maybe the moment will come, but he's certainly not going to talk about it, and we're not at that point where people say, would he do a pardon for leaving public life? I don't know, we're not there yet, but I do think the Israeli judiciary is fiercely independent, and I have faith in the judiciary.
Gil.
Thank you. You mentioned the conceptia, which is, triggers in every Israeli
Right,
this
of course.
1973
Of course.
Yom Kippur War.
Right.
In the context of October 7th, I wanted to just see what maybe we're also under this conceptia, or the paradigm
Right.
that we may have to think, because you yourself mentioned earlier that Hamas, we have had a few militants throw the PA officials off the rooftops in 2007. My question is, if we are to believe the security forces, that there were somewhat about 30,000 militants, right? Hamas militants in October 7th. They had to get some support. Each one of them has at least 2 parents, right? They have families, they have those Palestinians who were squeezed. For the most part, they're all men, right? They're all male. So if you do the math, you get quickly to hundreds of thousands of participants in some way, shape, or form, right? So my question is, should we consider Hamas as Gaza and Gaza as Hamas and stop talking about the innocent, right? The same way you say the IDF is Israel and Israel is the IDF.
Right.
So
No,
is
it's a
that the
great
conception that we are?
No, it's a great
maybe-
question, and look, I mean, I'll even sharpen it, if I could, even further, which is to say, look at the polling numbers when you ask people, do you approve of October the 7th? I think in the West Bank was 80% approved. I think in Gaza it was 70%, although I don't know how good the polling is after October 7th, but it was a very high number. And it's a very fair point. Look, for the White House, I think the president's whole strategy was to make a very, hard distinction between Hamas here, Palestinians there, and say, you want to go after Hamas? Go get them. They're worse than ISIS. That's what the president said when he visited Israel. But don't hurt innocent people. Again, you could say it's a standard we didn't uphold ourselves in Mosul when we had a much more favorable terrain with no tunnels. It was one city, not 8 or 9 cities. Like I said, read John Spencer from West Point on this. So it's a standard we don't hold to ourselves. But for the White House, it is a very important standard. Now, some people would say, look, what needs to happen is there needs to be some sort of, you use words that are loaded, I have to be careful, a new educational system there that would try to teach more coexistence. Now, I look back at Germany after World War II, Japan after World War II. What they had, though, is that they had authentic local people, like the Emperor Hirohito in Japan. Konrad Adenauer, was an amazing figure in Germany after World War II. And they embraced, there's a book called Embracing Defeat. They have to embrace defeat, but at least embrace a new set of westernized values or things like that. right now we don't have a Palestinian who is willing to be that authentic voice calling for that kind of re-education of sorts. And it's very delicate because people say, oh, so you want us to do Israeli brainwashing? I mean, that's how they will try to portray it, it's clear. And so what you really need are the Arab states themselves. You know, these Arab states that, and I haven't really had a chance to talk about the Emirates, and, you know, now they have their own curriculum. They've now introduced the Holocaust into the junior high schools, I believe, in the UAE. They have a credentialing process for imams in the UAE that's very about moderation. There's a lot of them. And you'd have to almost recast everything as kind of maybe schools of excellence. In other words, take some of the values part out of it and say, here, these are the best science schools. These are the best math schools in Gaza. But you would need an Arab world that would provide a frame that this is something that is positive, and it's not just we're bowing to Israel's dictates. And look, there's a problem here. I mean, I'm being very blunt, is that when the Prime Minister's office people come to Washington to talk about this idea, which they do, and I think it's a valid point, the White House says, and the State Department says to them, so you really basically want to totally recast political culture in this. That could take decades. Are you willing to commit during those next 3 decades, let's say, that you will not annex the West Bank, that you will not add settlements outside the security barrier, which is, 92% of the West Bank? Are you willing to undergo some self-restraint as Palestinians undergo this process of trying to shift the political culture, which is it's just hard to do under the best circumstances, but having gone through a conflict and as emotional with all the religious overtones, it is so hard. If you don't have an Arab world leading the way, right now we don't have a Palestinian who's going to do this. And Salam Fayyad is a friend of mine. I love the guy. He's at Princeton. He was a very successful prime minister of the Palestinians. He built schools, he built roads, he built clinics, he built all the things you want. And I'll never forget a story he told me, and I'm sorry if I'm just gonna tell you what an exceptional person he is. He would be the guy, in my view, if you had one leader who really would authenticate this. He's a PhD from the University of Texas. He worked at the IMF for many years. He said, I was sitting with him when he was prime minister in Ramallah of the Palestinians. And he said, David, I'm the only guy at night, before I go to sleep, I read Zionist history. I wanted to know, what? Yeah, Sinwar did maybe too. He watched TV. I don't know if I think Salam, as far as I know, went much further, although I know Sinwar wanted to understand the Israeli psyche. But he said, the Zionists, he said, were geniuses because they understood the role of institution building. He said from 1917 to 1947, from the Balfour Declaration to the UN partition, for those 30 years, they built Hebrew University. They built, Kupat Cholim, the sick fund. They built the Histadrut, the trade union. They built, banks. They built all the institutions. So he said by the time the Zionists declared the state, they had built the state. Arafat never told us that. He said, first declare, then we'll figure it out. And I realized how wrong he was, that we have to be institution builders. And to be institution builders, that means rules, that means, I think, coexistence with Israel. He would be the guy, in my view, who could lead such an effort. But right now, we don't see Abbas willing to do this. And believe me, he's 88 years old, okay, Abbas. And he doesn't want to give up. He said, I'll name a different prime minister, but it's going to be one of my hand-picked people. And unfortunately, it's not going to be, he doesn't want Fayyad's independence and, who put the budget on the internet and everything anti-corruption. He wants old school. And that old school, frankly, is, yes, Abbas is not calling for jihad against Israel. Things are much better today than it was under Arafat, don't get me wrong. But, we need a visionary to take things to the next level, to have an impact. And I don't see that right now. But your point is, frankly, is an important one because it speaks to the chasm that I worry about between the U.S. and Israel. That the U.S. sees I mean the U.S., when I mean the U.S., I mean the administration, sees, like I say, that hard division between Hamas and Palestinians. And Israelis say, no, if 80% of the people support this, or 70% in Gaza, we don't see it as just 30,000 militants. Yeah. No. I'm not saying that you're saying all Palestinians are terrorists.
Right. Gil, wonderful questions, but of course we have a lot of hands. Okay, Malcolm.
Thanks very much. I just have a very narrow and practical question. I hope can be answered fast. It seems to me that the pontoon bridge going to appear to be built,
the floating pier we call it,
is likely to be a fiasco. Why now? Was there any thought to bringing the aid into Ashkelon and driving it down to North Gaza to recruit the people from Rafah up to the other end, so that the Israeli army can get in with fewer civilians around?
Right. Look, you're asking also, these are all good questions. I mean, look, this thing, the floating pier, for those of you who aren't been following the news for the last couple days or so, has been something the U.S. and Israel has been talking about quietly, where maybe Israel would even do a security check in Cyprus. There would be this maritime corridor, and there would be this floating pier of the U.S. Navy or the Army Corps of Engineers, and the trucks would just roll off the landing ships and go to their place. And Israel has agreed to secure the landing area. But the missing piece, the missing link is, okay, NGOs are going to distribute it. The issue isn't supply. The issue is who's going to secure the distribution route from the pier to Gaza City. Now, the issue is more pronounced in the north, because again, Israel told everyone to go to the south, right? So the south at least has the trucks. That's where the people are, the 1.3 million. But there were like 250,000 people who didn't listen to Israel. Maybe they were older, maybe they couldn't, maybe they had a sick relative, I don't know. So the focus is on the northern Gazans, right? And here, you're going to say this is threading a needle, because on one hand, the U.S. doesn't want boots on the ground. The president, I think, said that in the State of the Union. I don't want boots on the ground. I don't want to put Americans in harm's way inside Gaza. But I want to get supplies to them, and there was understanding that the airlift, the air droppings were, first of all, I think 5 people have been killed because the thing fell on them or something, but it only got like 30,000 meals, and that wasn't really, that was more symbolic. Your point about why don't they just bring it into Ashdod, which is a port, which is right nearby, open up Erez, where I just was in December with this actress, I didn't know anything about pop culture, I'm so embarrassed, named Deborah Messing from Will and Grace, and there were 10 of us, and we saw the tunnels, we went through the Erez crossing. And it could be that ultimately Israel will yield on Erez. There's a problem here, is that the Israeli public says, wait a second, let me get this straight. We can't go back to our homes in southern Israel, Kfar Aza, Nir Oz, all the places, Be'eri, all these places. Our hostages are stuck in these tunnels, and the Red Cross can't even visit them. Even the medicines, we're not sure they got to the people that was supposedly brokered by the Red Cross, and the French. So let me get this straight. We're supposed to facilitate all this. Let's use this as a bargaining chip to get something for our hostages, or so our people could go back home. So that's when the president of the State of the Union said this should not be a bargaining chip, et cetera. So people are trying to thread needles here, and that Israel, was saying, look, we don't want to. We're not saying no. We want to secure the U.S. area, but are you counting on Israel now to secure the distribution route so the NGO can deliver? So I think Israel is a little wary about taking the lead, and also Israel hasn't decided how the governance in northern Gaza is going to look like, and it might be dependent on Israel. The problem is there's people, who are, that there's a real problem of nutrition, and it's real. And so Israel is trying to go along with the United States, but not be leading it in a way that would create a public backlash in Israel that says, you want us to give, but we don't get. We just give. No, we want to get as well as giving. It's complicated, and that's why I think that's the birth of the floating pier idea. And I share concerns about, is it going to work or not? But there's a whole backstory to this.
Okay, Itzik, and then
A quick question.
Yeah.
You spoke a little bit about Sinwar.
Yeah.
The guy is serious. He wants to empty the jails.
Yeah,
There was
he
no
does.
question about it.
No question.
How do you deal with a person like this?
Well, this is where the negotiations are. I mean, look, just for those of you who don't understand, Sinwar in 2011, there was a corporal named Gilad Shalit who was held for 5 years, and he became like everybody's kid. They could all say, hey, that could have been my grandson. He looks so young. Like, how could this guy be in a Hamas jail for 5 years? So there was like movements, free Gilad Shalit, free Gilad Shalit. And Israel released 1,037 prisoners for one corporal named Gilad Shalit. And guess who was in that group? Yahya Sinwar. And he was one of the hardened ones, and he told all the other hardened ones, I'm going to get you out. Like, I'm getting out, I'm going to get you out. I believe him. I think that's what he wants to do. And so when people said to me, is there going to be a deal on March 10th? Today, you know, I said, well, look, part of it is how he looks at his role in history, and does he want to use Ramadan to light things up, which I was always fearful of. But also, in the best case, he's going to want to drive a hard bargain and get as many of the hardcore killers out on the street. And that's going to be very hard for Israel. And by the way, that's only for the 40, not for the remaining people alive who are young males. What they call males are like young is like 18, 19, I think, to 50 or something. Now you could say, hey, this guy hasn't done reserve duty in 10 years. Hamas says, I don't care. We call him a military prisoner. You want your military, we want our military. Israel said, these guys did nothing. They were hostages. They did nothing. These guys blew up people. You know, they don't care. So right now what we think is that Sinwar is taking the males, right? And if there's 40 of the women, older people, and you know, and the injured, you know, we're hearing numbers. I want to be careful not to identify with this number, so no one. I don't want anyone to say David says. I don't want anyone to tweet David says. You know, but what if the number really is 64 people alive, and that means 24 males who are maybe keeping up with Sinwar as he moves around tunnels. The older people can't keep up with him. But he sees them literally as human shields to keep up with him as he goes through the tunnel maze at Khan Yunis or wherever he is. So he's going to want, you know, much more killers out on the street for that remaining number. I mean, these are excruciating dilemmas for Israel. But the Sinwar, you know, release in 2011 for Sinwar is like, I want to replicate that. Israel says, no way, we're not going back to 1,037 for one. But he's thinking of doing this in phases. Clearly, he wanted some hardcore people out in the first phase, and he wants many more hardcore in the second phase. So it's a real excruciating dilemma. And you know, you've all seen the pictures of the families with the T-shirts, you know, bring them home and everything, and some of you have them here. And you can understand the families, for sure, and the dog tags, and I see some of those here too. So, I mean, I understand it. I know there's some just very tough dilemmas here that have to be reached. And, you know, from the family perspective is, okay, we can work about all these things, but my kid has been there for 156 days in a dungeon, and how long can they hold out? And I mean, your heart breaks, because you know how serious this is for these people, and you don't know. I was really, this Shabbat, Rabbi, I was asked to be the Shaliach Tzibur, and I really thought of it to be the Chazan, to lead the services, that this was like a Yom Kippur, like you read the Natana Tokef, you know, who shall live, who shall die. This is like the, you know, providential, you know, this is where the verdict, this is where fate is sealed. And I just pray that these 40 people that they get out this week. You know, I mean, it'll be a staggered thing over a month, over Ramadan, but because I worry if we miss this window, you know, what's going to be with these people?
Is it Eddie? Yes.
Hi, I had a question. I sort of want to pivot.
Yeah.
Even like when you look at how things are being looked at worldwide and everything, do you think that the government can control its extreme right-wing ministers? I mean, in the aspect that they seem to be almost agitating it to be worse. Or you may not have that opinion.
Yeah, no,
So-
no, look, there's so many different layers to this point, you know, about the role, you know, here was like the president and the prime minister cut a deal on flour. They cut a deal on Kerem Shalom, and here you had ministers trying to unravel what was agreed upon by the prime minister and the president. So, look, I think what happened this past week on the age of 50, you know, with the Israeli Arabs, where the Shin Bet says, the national security of Israel is at stake, Mr. Prime Minister. You really have to agree to lift these restrictions. And by the way, huge risk on them, because what if some of these people turn out to be, you know, provocateurs at Temple Mount, at the Al-Aqsa? So I don't know. I think here was a case where the prime minister was faced with an operational kind of thing, and it was like, who do I listen to? Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Now, the advantage was you had Benny Gantz in the cabinet, in the war cabinet, in the 5-member cabinet. You had Gadi Eisenkot in the 5-member cabinet. And, you know, I think that was, you know, it was having them there and having the security people was like stereo, you know, saying, this is crazy. You know, we shouldn't be listening to them. If the security people tell us we should ease up, we should trust our own Shin Bet, our own FBI, what they're saying. Well, I think it was a vote. It depends what the issue is. So some of it might have needed a cabinet vote. I'm not aware if they actually, you know, the vote was 3-2 or 4-1. You know, it's a 5-member cabinet. But 2 of them are actually observers. So if you want to be even more technical about it, so it's 2-1. I don't know if there was an actual vote. I really don't know the details, but the prime minister said, we're going to go with the security services. So the question is, at each point, at what point the security services assert their opinions? And of course, the hard right is going to say that they are getting involved in politics, and that's not their job. So, you know, I don't know. On certain points, they could prevail, but in the long term, I'm worried that I don't think Israel, basically, I think the nature of Israel's problems are so difficult that Israel cannot afford what I call an end zone government, not on the right end zone or the left end zone. They have to have people from the middle of the field. They might have people to the right, that's good. And people in the center, that's good. And maybe some center left, good. But I think it's gotta be within a zone, and I don't think Israel, it lives in a tinderbox. And I don't think that they could take decisions that the security services think is dangerous for Israeli national security. I think they have to be very mindful of that. So.
Okay, we have one more, I see one more hand at the moment, and I'm going to say that will be the...
2. Yeah, go down, it's fine.
All right, we'll have a couple more questions, but before we take them, I want to remind you all that we have another opportunity to hear from David tomorrow at Hillel in Isla Vista at 3 o'clock. He'll be speaking together with Raif al-Omari, a Palestinian analyst who, as David and I think Steve mentioned this also, they have done a lot of speaking together all over the country. So that's tomorrow at 3 o'clock at Hillel. The title of the session is The Israel-Hamas War, Policy Issues and Public Opinion. So before we go to the final questions, I'll just remind you of that. So,
also, if I could throw in a public service
sure.
announcement, if I lose people in the last question or so, For those of you who go on Twitter, or your kids or grandkids go on now called X or Instagram, which I admit I don't know how to use that well, but I have research assistants to do. So I do try to put something up like every day that like either it adds an article that I read that I thought was interesting, or a few sentences of context. And so for those of you who are looking for that, also the Washington Institute, we try to have analytical pieces almost every day on what's going on, washingtoninstitute.org. So for those of you looking for information, I get this from college students more than anything else. What should I read? What should I read? I want to know what to read. You know, I would say of the newspapers that I feel have tried, and I'm sure that there are a lot that have tried well, and I'm not here to slam anybody, except for Al Jazeera, which I am happy to slam. But I would say the Times of Israel has really done a good job in trying to be down the middle and giving a very kind of practical, non-ideological, grounded kind of views, and I would endorse their piece.
Thank you. That's good to know. Yes. Oh, okay. And also, I should mention that the talk, actually tonight's talk also, but also tomorrow's talk is part of the Taubman Symposium in Jewish Studies, and the director of which, Dr. Lee Rothfarb, is here tonight. Okay.
So talking about the time of Israel, I read recently in it that the Qatar was beginning to get very impatient with Hamas.
Yeah.
What's in it for Qatar to support, to keep supporting them, and why can't they twist their arms a little more?
This is a crucial question. I mean, it's funny, I just posted something this afternoon on this point. Qatar is an unusual, I was talking to my hosts about this right before I came over here. It's a very unusual actor. It's like something we've never seen before. They are a speck of a Persian Gulf country that happens to be very wealthy, one of 6. Sometimes we jokingly call them ABS, anything but Saudi. Like they have a very contrarian streak. Now, the way they market themselves is we are indispensable to the United States because we talk to problematic actors, or as they call it to me, actors of people in the doghouse in the United States. And that's our cachet. Like, you know, Saudi will always be wealthier than us. The Emiratis will be wealthier than us. But we're like the Mavericks. We talk, you know, you're the Taliban, we talk to the Taliban. You want to do a deal on releasing certain bank account funds to Iran, we talk to Iran. They claim they only are housing Ismail Haniyeh, Khalid Mashal in Doha, in their capital, because Condoleezza Rice in 2006, according to them, and I'm not disputing that, by the way, said we need some communications channel with Hamas, and we as the United States can't do it. So if you want to talk to them, by having them in your country, people will be able to monitor their communications better. It's better that them being there than being in Iran or Afghanistan or I don't know, somewhere that we don't have such a handle on being able to intelligence monitoring. So that's the way, obviously, the Qataris sold it. Better to be in a place where you know what's going on than in countries where you won't know. But my question to them, and I said this in front of a big group, I said, look, you present this as like a pass-fail course. Like you're doing the absolute minimum because the Americans asked you in 2006. But I see Al Jazeera as spewing anti-American hatred. And by the way, you're talking to a guy who goes on Arab television all the time. I have nothing against Arab television. I don't think they're fair. Often in Israel, they've got their slant, their point of view, but okay. But I don't go on Jazeera. And I said, like, you guys are like basically the propaganda arm of Hamas. And don't tell me about Condoleezza Rice in 2006. You're doing this every single day. And I'm supposed to believe that this is a pass-fail, that you're doing the minimum because of 2006? I just don't buy it. So now it is true that when Israel wanted to keep the lid on Gaza and didn't want to pay itself, the only people who would pay was the Qataris, $30 million a month. And if the check didn't arrive on time on the first of the month, they sent balloons. I know this is sounding like out of a movie, but Middle East, you know, facts are stranger than fiction. they would send a balloon into an Israeli field with arsenic to burn an Israeli field. So Israel had this love-hate relations with the Qataris, which is, why are you funding the Brotherhood? But no one else will fund the Brotherhood, and we want someone to fund the Brotherhood because we don't want to pay $30 million a month. Now, most of the time, that money actually did go through the World Food Program, the UNDP, UN Development Program. But in recent years, some of it went in suitcases directly to Hamas. So right now, Israel has kind of felt, okay, we're stuck. Like, you know, we need someone who could talk to Hamas. So they've been convenient. But I would posit, if this thing that people said was supposed to start tonight doesn't happen, then suddenly people are going to look differently. And that's why I think there's been reports that Qatar is trying to get ahead of the curve and saying, we might throw them out. And when I asked the Qataris, I said, by your logic, the Condoleezza Rice asked you in 2006 to let them in. What if the United States in 2024 asked you to let them out, to kick them out? He goes, we're not married to these people. So I wonder if that is going to be, you know, a consequence if this deal falls through this week. We'll see. Until this week, I think you would say, look, whatever I thought of the Qataris, don't kick them out because human life is in the balance. But if they can't deliver, then I think people are going to look differently at Qatar.
Ravid, do you still?
So thank you, David. So can you comment on the feasibility and logistics of evacuating civilians from Rafah?
This is the $64,000 question. You know, I don't know the answer. I asked Israelis, I said, show me how this is going to work. There's an area called the Muwasi, which used to be where Gush Katif was closer to the beach in southeastern Gaza, you know, and there's some area a little north of there. There's a few other open areas. This is, but the numbers are staggering, 1.3 million people. And that's why I don't believe Israel will go into Rafah, which is during Ramadan, because I think this, if you're really serious, you're going to need a month of, and even that won't be enough maybe, of serious preparation. What about the sanitary side? I mean, look, it's true, the weather's getting a little better, but you know, tent cities are not a picnic, but what's the sanitation like? I mean, there's going to be questions here. And you really, to me, this is a huge question, because that's why I call it the $64,000 question, because I worry that if this is not done carefully, this will really lead. And again, I'm not saying what I want. I'm speaking as an analyst, okay? Not what I'm advocating. But I'm saying as an analyst, I worry this will bring a much deeper, I don't want to use the word collision, but tension with the White House and Israel. Because this is what they want. They say, we never said Israel not to go into Rafah. We want to see a plan. We want to see an evacuation. And I gotta think, you know, I came up with this idea of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on the Egyptian side. Deal with the tunnels. Show that Rafah is not the be-all, end-all, you know, that you've got to block this off. And I don't know. I think that if Israel's serious, and I do take Israel very seriously, that say, hey, there's 4 battalions there. Yeah, there might not be the elite troops. Yes, they might be the most corrupt. Yes, because they do the most smuggling. Yes, all that's true. But there's still 4 battalions. If they feel they need that, I'm not a general. I'm not there to question the military value. But I do think you need to spend the next month on making sure that you have alternative plans. And it's not easy. I don't do displacement. But just also know that Israelis have been displaced too. And you've got tens of thousands in the south. We didn't really get a chance to talk in depth about Lebanon and the 80,000 on the northern border, Kiryat Shmona, Manara, all these places, Metula, you know, I mean, 80,000 people away from their homes. And that creates pressure on the Israeli government, on Lebanon. Now, I personally don't think Israel's going to attack Hezbollah. That's a different story. I think there's working on some effort to get them away from the border, but you have to deploy people on the border that you could trust, you know, and this is the problem in general, is that without enforcement, no deal is worth anything. And I try to say that, I say it on the PBS NewsHour when I talk about two states. I said, look, what sort of state are we talking about? If it's a state like Costa Rica, then every Israeli will sign up. Maybe not on the hard right, but every other Israeli would sign up who doesn't see this through an ideological lens. The problem is Israel's experience with Gaza and Lebanon is when you withdraw, you don't get Costa Rica. You get a mini Iran. And it depends on the quality of the state. Now, to me, I don't say that as a reason not to do things on the Palestinian issue, but I just think it's an incremental process. And we've tried to hit home runs. Again, I'm sorry for the sports analogies. We should hit some singles and doubles and work towards a goal, even if it takes longer, but make sure we get there. And that means enforcement. That means making sure if Hezbollah has moved away from the border. And I get the women who are buying gun licenses and all that. You know, their view is, if it happened in the south, why can't it happen in the north? And I'm going to bring my kids back to that environment. I get that completely. Israel's got to know that Hezbollah is away from the border. And the 1701, the Security Council resolution of 2006 that was supposed to accomplish it, didn't accomplish it. No one enforced it. And the Lebanese armed forces were supposed to deploy, and they ran away. So if you're Israel, what do you want from Israel? I mean, in 2007, Hamas outmuscled. In 2006, Hezbollah outmuscled. Until we have people with muscle to enforce against these terror groups, we'll never have a deal. So I think Israel, I understand where Israel's coming from when it comes to Gaza, but I also think there's got to be some vision about a future, but that future has to have a very strong enforcement mechanism. And I pray that somehow this month of Ramadan passes peacefully, and that it be a month of reflection, introspection, but I'm afraid that's not what Sinwar wants. And I'm very worried that this deal is unraveling before our eyes, and that this is going to be a tough month. And I have to tell you, just to put the seatbelts, put the tray tables in the upright positions and buckle up, because it could get very bumpy. It could be turbulence ahead. I pray that I'm wrong. Thank you very much.
So I just want to, David, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us here, and I think there's other people watching on Zoom also. You've really given us so much great insight, information, and if not great hope, at least some sense of what to pray for. So thank you.